A U.S. destroyer cuts hard through the churning black water. The air inside the control room is thick with a terror that whispers rather than shouts. They are hunting a German U-boat, but the hunt is blind. The sonar operator rips the headset from his ears. A high-pitched shriek. He slams his hand down on the console. "Nothing, Captain. We lost him again." The captain stands braced against the chart table. For the last 2 hours, they have been circling a single patch of the North Atlantic where a merchant ship was just torpedoed. The U-boat is down there, close. They can feel it, but the ocean is refusing to give up its secrets. He shouldn't be able to just vanish, the captain mutters, the rage in his voice quickly smothered by cold strategy. What this experienced captain did not know was that the German U-boat commander wasn't just hiding behind clever maneuvers with decoy tactics. He was hiding behind science. He was hiding inside an invisible layer of water, a natural phenomenon that turned America's most advanced detection technology, their sonar, into useless noise. The deadliest weapon in World War II was not a gun, a torpedo, or a bomber. It was data. It was the classified, highly precise knowledge of the ocean's depth, temperature, and salinity. And the U.S. Navy was completely, terrifyingly unprepared to fight a war against the physics of the sea. Welcome to World War II Obscura. The early days of the war were a massacre. Hitler's U-boats, hunting in packs, the famous wolf packs, were sinking Allied shipping at an unsustainable rate. They called it the Second Battle of the Atlantic, but for the Allies it was an absolute rout. Every sunken ship meant less food for Britain, less oil for tanks, and fewer troops making it to the European theater. The U-boat was an existential threat, and for a long time the U.S. Navy had no answer. They had ships, they had sonar, but why were they losing? Why? Because American naval strategy was built on the assumption that the open ocean was uniform, a vast, consistent block of water. The Germans knew better. They knew that the ocean was actually a complex, layered environment. It was a physics problem, and the German Navy was exploiting the rules of physics to win the war. The answer came not from the great admirals of the fleet or the engineers in the design bureaus, but from a quiet academic institution on the Massachusetts coast, Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. Specifically, it came from a brilliant, unassuming scientist named Mary Sears. Mary Sears was born in Wayland, Massachusetts, and she grew up exploring the natural world around her, collecting animals, particularly frogs, and setting up terrariums. This passion set her life's path. She graduated from Radcliffe College in 1927, then receiving both her master's degree and doctorate from Radcliffe in quick succession. She worked as a marine zoologist. She studied tiny floating organisms, plankton, and the ecosystems of the sea. By 1941, she was one of the few people in the world with a deep, systemic understanding of how the ocean actually worked. Her specialty was microscopic life, but the Navy was about to task her with mapping the physics of war. This is the story of how a small team of scientists, mostly women, traded their academic textbooks for classified maps and used the secret architecture of the deep sea to turn the tide against the U-boat menace. The war was won not just on the sea, but by the sea, and by the people who learned its secrets. The problem the U.S. Navy faced was the thermocline. Imagine the ocean as a swimming pool that hasn't been stirred. The surface is warm from the sun, but a few feet down, the water is suddenly cold. That rapid drop in temperature is the thermocline. It's an invisible, distinct barrier. The Germans had figured out that this layer wasn't just a change in temperature, it was a fundamental change in density, and it was a perfect defense against American sonar. When a sonar signal hits the thermocline, the change in water density bends the sound waves. The sound does not simply penetrate the layer, it creates an acoustic shadow beneath it. So a U-boat commander, knowing this physical law, would simply dive just below the thermocline and go completely silent and invisible to any surface ship's listening gear. They were hiding in a pocket of physics. In 1942, the Navy realized they were blind. They reached out to Woods Hole, the heart of American oceanography. The air in the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute was heavy with the smell of brine and old papers. Mary Sears, in her early 30s, looked up from a microscope slide. A U.S. Navy courier, his uniform impeccable and out of place, stood awkwardly at her doorway. He laid a large folded map on her desk. Not a map of the ocean floor, but a map of the surface. The paths of countless sinking Allied ships were marked in dense black ink. The Admiral's request was simple and terrifying. Tell us where the submarines are hiding. Sears knew immediately what the Navy needed, not just depth measurements, but a prediction of where that acoustic shadow, the thermocline, would form, at what depth and when. The only way to answer this was to predict the temperature and salinity of the water across the entire North Atlantic, an impossible task. She looked at the map, then at the limited, dusty academic papers scattered around her lab. The theoretical knowledge existed, buried in various small journals, but had never been compiled, cross-referenced, or put into a practical military format. The pressure was immense. Every hour she spent compiling charts was an hour a U-boat was free to kill. She'd been tasked with saving the shipping lanes using nothing but the history of the deep ocean. The ocean was fighting back, and only data could win. Sears was immediately commissioned into the Navy's Waves, women accepted for volunteer emergency service, and moved to the Navy's hydrographic office in Washington, D.C. She wasn't sent to a research vessel or a command center. She was sent to an office tasked with running the world's first naval oceanographic intelligence unit. She needed data, but wartime collection was almost non-existent. Ships weren't taking systemic readings. Submarines certainly weren't. So Mary Sears and her growing team, mostly female scientists, cartographers, and mathematicians, scoured the world for clues. They hunted down pre-war academic papers written in obscure languages. They sifted through the logbooks of old fishing fleets. They even used anecdotal weather reports and historical records of unusual currents. The work was grueling and monastic. They were essentially reverse engineering the ocean, predicting temperature, salinity, and density based on fragments of historical evidence. The result of this frantic, data-driven labor was a series of classified documents known as submarine supplements to the sailing directions. These were not just maps. They were predictive operational guides. They told the U.S. Navy, in this square of ocean during this month, expect the thermocline to be at 150 feet. Therefore, if you can't find a U-boat, look 50 feet below that layer. The very idea of fighting a war based on an ephemeral, invisible layer of physics was revolutionary. It required a total philosophical shift in naval thinking. Commanders who had spent 30 years relying on instinct and seamanship now had to trust a prediction made by a lady scientist ashore hundreds of miles away. Their new intelligence was soon put to the test, and the lives of dozens of sailors hung on its accuracy. The U.S. Navy destroyer USS Buckley is on patrol in the North Atlantic. The captain, Lieutenant Commander Brent Abel, is staring at a depth reading. Next to it is a freshly issued submarine supplement chart. They have established contact with a U-boat, a contact that quickly vanished. Now the sonar is useless. The traditional desperate tactic would be to drop a pattern of depth charges where the sub was last seen, hoping to get lucky, a blind toss. But Captain Abel glances down at his chart. The hand-drawn line compiled by Sears' team predicts that in this sector, at this time of day, the thermocline should be at 120 feet. The U-boat, following its own German operational intelligence, is certainly hiding below that 120-foot layer, safe in the acoustic shadow. Abel makes a terrifying, evidence-based decision. He orders his crew to set the depth charges not for where they think the sub is, but for a calculated depth below the thermocline, 200 feet. He's trusting the data over the sound in his ears. The depth charges roll off the stern and sink into the icy blackness. The entire ship holds its breath. Seconds later, the ocean erupts, not only from the explosion, but from the sudden violent decompression of a hull. Splintered wood and oil bubble to the surface. The German U-boat, attempting to hide in the physics of the sea, had been outsmarted by the superior physics of Mary Sears' charts. The new intelligence worked. It gave Allied commanders the predictive power they needed to turn the wolfpack into the hunted. The flow of shipping began to recover. The Battle of the Atlantic, the single longest campaign of World War II, began to turn one data point at a time. The victory in the Atlantic was profound, but the war was constantly shifting, forcing Mary Sears' team to adapt. They needed to apply their unique data-driven approach to the unforgiving environment of the Pacific. In the Pacific, the challenge was not U-boats and deep-sea sonar, but amphibious landings. For an invasion to succeed, thousands of troops and tons of equipment had to be delivered from ship to shore. This required navigating a new set of lethal tides: the surf, the currents, and the hidden geology of the beach. Off the coast of Tarawa, a small cluster of landing craft, Higgins boats, crested a wave and then plunged down, not into the surf, but onto a hidden coral shelf. The boats ground to a halt hundreds of yards from the beach. U.S. Marines, weighed down by their gear, were forced to wade the remaining distance, fully exposed to enemy fire. Many drowned. equipment was lost. The entire landing timetable was thrown into chaos, leading to catastrophic losses of men and momentum. The failure exposed a fatal scientific vulnerability. The U.S. Navy had been relying on generalized theoretical surf and tide charts. They needed littoral oceanography, the study of coastal zones, and they needed it for every single tiny island in the Pacific theater. Sears and her team shifted focus overnight. They had to create prediction models for waves, breakers, and beach gradients based on highly localized data, often captured Japanese charts, fuzzy aerial reconnaissance photos, and pre-war scientific expedition reports. The complexity was staggering. The data for the deep-sea Atlantic was sparse. The data for 1,000 obscure Pacific islands was practically non-existent. They pioneered surf forecasting. They created precise tables that told commanders not only where the waves would break, but how high the waves would be, ensuring that landing craft hit the beach at the precise moment of slack tide, avoiding hidden obstacles and maximizing efficiency. The application of this surf prediction science in later major operations, like the final bloody landings leading up to the end of the war, was a resounding success, saving countless lives and ensuring that the logistical complexity of the Pacific War could actually be executed. Mary Sears' office had evolved from a small data processing unit into an essential strategic component of American victory in both theaters. The small, often overlooked science of the sea had become a lethal weapon. When the war finally ended in 1945, Mary Sears had risen to the rank of lieutenant commander. She and her team, many of whom were women working in a highly classified, male-dominated military structure, had completed an unimaginable task. They had fundamentally changed the nature of naval warfare. But their victory was silent. The submarine supplements and the forecasting manuals were immediately stamped with the highest level of military secrecy. Sears stood in the quiet of the empty office. She looked at the stacks of charts and meticulously organized boxes of data, the thousands of hours of work that had dictated the fate of two oceans. She knew personally the weight of those charts. They represented lives saved in the North Atlantic and successful landings in the Pacific. Yet she could not speak of the work. She could not publish the data. She couldn't claim the professional credit that would have instantly made her a star in the post-war scientific community. Her contribution was deemed too sensitive, too strategically vital to ever be shared publicly. Mary Sears became known as the First Lady of Oceanography, and her post-war career, while influential in founding the scientific journal Deep Sea Research, never fully reflected the strategic genius she displayed during the war. She and the science she pioneered remained classified for decades. In the fall of 2000, the U.S. Navy launched the USNS Mary Sears, an oceanographic research vessel named in her honor. Mary Sears' story reveals that the greatest battles are often decided in the quiet spaces, in the data points, and in the hands of people whose names never make the history books. It reveals the power of scientific discipline to bring order and meaning to wartime chaos. The ocean is still a vast mystery, but thanks to Mary Sears, World War II was the war where humanity finally learned to read its most lethal secrets. Her story endures because it reminds us to look deeper, not just at the ships and the guns, but at the intellectual currents that directed them. The real turning point of the war happened not in a council of admirals, but in a small office where a dedicated team used the laws of physics to bring down the deadliest weapon of the Third Reich. If you want to see more forgotten stories, hit like, subscribe, and leave a comment with a person or mission you think we should cover. Thank you for watching, and remember, history is larger than we could ever imagine.